It's Monday, October 7th, 2024, and we are 28 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Harms. Today on the show, Kamala Harris kicks off a 48-hour media blitz in some of the usual places and some places that are not so usual. So this week, Harris was on the Call Her Daddy podcast. Tonight is her 60 Minutes interview. Tomorrow, she's on The View, then Howard Stern's Sirius XM show, and then tomorrow night, she'll be on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. It's a really interesting set of choices from the campaign, a mix of traditional comedy, clearly, but also some serious exposure to people, women in particular, who might not be as engaged as other voters, but will still get exposure to her. And what I mean by that is that the people who listen to Howard Stern, who listen to Call Her Daddy, don't go to those shows for overtly political news or breakdowns or even content like that. Not that they don't talk about those things and they aren't people who think about those things. And it's not to say that those shows aren't smart about them when they do talk about them. It's just not their main focus and not why people tune in. But I'm going to talk about Call Her Daddy more in a minute because I think it was a serious change in the way that we understand campaigning. The View is a little different than those other two, right? It's not journalism. It's a daytime talk show that's a cross between political punditry and reality TV, but it's still about the news. And most importantly for the campaign, it's aimed at the 24 to 25 million women who are stay-at-home moms. The Late Show is the same, but a little different. It's topical, but it's not news. Its audience is much more mixed than The View, but Colbert is certainly outwardly liberal and exposes viewers to far fewer viewpoints than his own, which makes it a very friendly space for Harris, but that's important because with just a month left, she's likely not going to be changing anybody's mind, so what she will be trying to do, and don't get me wrong, Trump will do this too, Harris is going to try to make sure that she gives her base and Democratic voters a reminder about why they're voting for her in the first place. It's just making sure that there aren't any cracks in the foundation this close to Election Day. And then, of course, there's the 60 Minutes interview, which is one of the most rigorous interview processes out there. I'll have a preview clip of that coming up in a bit, but I want to talk about Call Her Daddy first. So if you don't know what Call Her Daddy is, you probably aren't a millennial woman, but it's the fourth most listened to podcast in the country. The show started in 2018 as a Barstool sports show with host Alex Cooper and former host Sophia Franklin. And then they would talk about relationships, sex. They would read listener stories about sex and give advice. Usually it was a little spicier, a little taboo, but pretty funny. And that's where the name of the show comes from. When they'd hit a thing that they thought was really funny, they'd say, Call Her Daddy, as sort of this tongue-in-cheek joke. Then it becomes the name of the show. But they also have guests on, and when the show was bought by Spotify, Franklin left, and Alex Cooper turned that show into more about relationships, mental health, the importance of therapy, and women's rights issues. The show was then bought this past summer for $100 million by Sirius and has about 5 million weekly listeners, almost all of them women, and it's women from across the political spectrum because the show isn't necessarily meant to be political. So you can understand why Harris would want to go on this show. This is reaching a demographic where, yes, Harris has a lot of support. She's outperforming Trump with women by almost 20% or so. And if you listen to Saturday's episode, you'll remember I talked about that huge gender gap between men voting for Trump and women voting for Harris. But because of that, she gets to talk to women who are already going to be voting for her, sort of that foundation checking like I was saying before. And she gets to talk to women who maybe weren't planning on voting for her, but they see Call Her Daddy as a safe space for women because it is built for women. It's a show that understands them and talks about the things that they're thinking about and talking about with their friends. That does mean, yes, a lot of this interview was about abortion, but also just as much of it was about the place of women in America and making America safer for women, to use the same phrase that Alex Cooper did. And also, just a heads up, there is going to be some discussion of sexual assault and abortion here. Nothing graphic, but if that's not for you, if it's not your thing, I don't want to catch you off guard. Okay. At the beginning, Harris was asked about her own mother, how she was raised and the kinds of things her mom taught her. There were some really striking moments about how her mom talked to her about having agency and ownership over her emotions and actions. Here it is.
Figure out where you are in a moment, right? And center yourself. I mean, to your point, when I got older, like when I was in, I don't know, late teens, my 20s, if I came home with a problem, I'm telling you, every time if I came home with a problem, the first thing my mother would do is she would look at me. Like other mothers, I believe, were hugging their kids and like, oh, honey, what can I do? And my mother, the first thing, what did you do? But here's the thing that I realized. She was actually teaching me, think about where you had agency in that moment. And think about what you had the choice to do or not do. And like, don't let things just happen to you. And I realized that was a really powerful thing she was teaching, which is figure out how you can take charge of a moment.
Yeah.
You can't always. We don't have control of everything, obviously. But don't just let things happen to you without thinking about, okay, what can I do in this moment?
So I thought this was a really interesting answer here because it's sort of a nod to what we think of being an important quality in men is to be action takers. And not that women don't have it too, it's just something that we think about and talk about more when it comes to men. And in terms of how we talk about different versions of presidents, there is a model of the presidency called the active president. It's somebody who takes action, takes charge while they're in the Oval Office. And it reminded me of my favorite presidential quote, which is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which is, take a place wherever you are and be somebody, take action. What Harris was saying there was just a different version of saying that same thing. Now, this answer from Harris might have been a truthful answer. It might have been something that's been massaged as a campaign response. But we've heard her talk about her mom before, though this was definitely more open than I've heard her talk about her mom, at least in a setting like this one, not like a campaign book or something. And it was an answer that was clearly chosen by the campaign to evoke an image of somebody who was going to be active, who was going to wield presidential power in a take action sort of a way. It was just a really interesting way to do that. Now, there was also an entire piece of this interview about sexual assault and domestic abuse and trying to fight those things in the U.S. Like I said, it's a big part of what Cooper talks about on the show. 1 in 3 women will experience some sort of sexual assault over the course of their lifetime. 2 in 5 women will experience some kind of domestic abuse. And Harris used that question and that topic as an opportunity to talk about economics because study after study shows that women in abusive relationships have little to no power over their own finances. In fact, a study from the National Network to End Domestic Violence found that financial abuse happens in 99% of domestic abuse cases. Now, I know a lot of that is not uplifting, but Harris, reframing her economic plan to talk about how it works at the ground level instead of how we normally talk about economics on a national scale, was another really interesting way that she was able to humanize her policies in this interview, like student loan debt relief, small business loans, or housing policies for mostly the women who were listening. Harris also talked about the slight that was thrown her way a few weeks ago by Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, where Sanders made a wraparound insult about Harris. Cooper reads the quote, but I thought Harris's answer was really interesting here. For those who don't know, Harris doesn't have biological children, but does have 2 stepchildren from her husband's first marriage.
I saw the governor of Arkansas said, "My kids keep me humble." Unfortunately, Kamala Harris doesn't have anything keeping her humble. How did that make you feel?
I don't think she understands that there are a whole lot of women out here who, 1, are not aspiring to be humble. 2, a whole lot of women out here who have a lot of love in their life, family in their life, and children in their life. And I think it's really important for women to lift each other up. You know, I'll tell you, Alex, one of the things that I have really enjoyed about where the discussion has gone, one of the places it's gone, we have our family by blood, and then we have our family by love. And I have both. And I consider it to be a real blessing. And I have 2 beautiful children, Cole and Ella, who call me Mamala. We have a very modern family.
So it was another moment where she came across as more relatable, talking about her family, and that's happened in the past, but the line about women who don't want to be humble, I think, is something that probably resonated with a lot of listeners who tune into the podcast, hosted by a woman who unapologetically broke away from a toxically bro-y brand and network with Barstool Sports, and then sold for a combined $160 million in the span of 6 years. They don't tune in because Alex Cooper made her name by being humble. She's aspirational, in the way a lot of men see Donald Trump and his story. And contrasts like that were all over this interview. Now, things did turn to abortion, bodily autonomy, and women's control over their bodies when it comes to the government, and what Trump has been saying about abortion. Here was the first exchange.
I do want to reference something I saw was at a rally in Pennsylvania. Former President Trump recently told women, "You will be protected and I will be your protector." What do you make of that?
So he who, when he was president, hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention that they would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. And they did just as he intended. And there are now 20 states with Trump abortion bans, including bans that make no exception for rape or incest, which we just discussed, which means that you're telling a survivor of a crime of a violation to their body they don't have a right to make a decision about what happens to their body next, which is immoral. So this is the same guy that is now saying that. This is the same guy who said that women should be punished for having abortions. This is the same guy who uses the kind of language he does to describe women. So, yeah, there you go.
Like I said, a lot of contrasting between her and Trump in a space built for women. There was also this one thing, and it's a little longer, but I think it's worth playing the whole thing.
I do want to clarify something. In the debate, former President Trump claimed that some states are executing babies after birth. Can you just clarify?
That is not happening anywhere in the United States. It is not happening, and it's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie that he is suggesting that. Can you imagine? He is suggesting that women in their 9th month of pregnancy are electing to have an abortion. Are you kidding? That is so outrageously inaccurate, and it's so insulting to suggest that that would be happening and that women would be doing that. It's not happening anywhere. This guy is full of lies. I mean, I just have to be very candid with you. So in my career, from the time I got out of law school through most of my career as a prosecutor, I understood that the words that I spoke and what I did with those words would be the difference between whether somebody was charged with a crime or went to prison, maybe prison for life. When I was Attorney General, I was the top law enforcement officer of the biggest state in this country. And I was acutely aware that the words I spoke could be the difference between whether a corporation was in business or out of business, that the words I spoke could move markets. The idea that someone is not only so careless and irresponsible and reckless, but out and out lies to create fear and division in our country and thinks he should be president of the United States standing behind the seal of the president of the United States using the microphone that comes with that and using that voice and those words in such an irresponsible, and that's mild, way. And this is why this election matters.
So Harris has said a line like that or a version of that line in other interview settings before, and certainly most listeners to Call Her Daddy probably haven't heard her say something like this before. I do also want to do a quick fact check here. Harris is right when she says that there are no states that allow for so-called post-birth abortions. That's homicide. Post-birth abortion is a made-up political term based on a willful ignorance of how medical procedures actually work. in which a fetus has to be extracted or a baby is born with such a defect that they won't survive and need immediate end-of-life care in the minutes and hours after being born. But there was some more talk about abortion and getting women out to vote, but that was pretty much it for Call Her Daddy. And, between the mini on Saturday and this, I'm really thinking about making the full episode about women voters in this election this week. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. But Harris going on this podcast is a big deal because between this and then Trump doing quite a few of the Manosphere podcasts and streams that he was on, it's a sign that the political class is starting to see the value in finding voters where they are again. A lot like in 2008 when the Obama campaign used social media, Facebook in particular, to target certain voters and to really build a groundswell of voters outside of mainstream media. And just like back then, traditional media has been complaining about it. Just yesterday morning, the Politico Playbook, which is like a super insidery DC thing, but still traditional media, complained that Harris wasn't doing enough media interviews and then proceeded in that same article to talk about all of the interviews she was doing this week. It's really just campaigns finding a way to not talk to traditional media. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. For me, for absolutely selfish reasons, I would like her to do more actual mainstream media. I think we should just be in mainstream media and media in general more often anyway. But again, like I said, that's just a purely self-serving instinct. Campaigns don't have that. And this choice by her and the choices that were made by Trump are really telling of where things might be going when it comes to where people are getting their news. Speaking of getting their news, tonight is Harris's 60 Minutes interview. So she is sitting down with mainstream press. Trump is not doing one. He turned down 60 Minutes after they said they wanted to do cutaways during the interview for fact checks. That was according to a campaign spokesperson. Trump said it was because he never got an apology over CBS's coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop story. I don't know. But it's also worth saying here that Call Her Daddy also reached out to the Trump campaign and opened the door to an interview there. So who knows, we could see him go on that podcast too. But this Harris interview on 60 Minutes will be her toughest one since becoming the candidate. The audience expects more from her, and the questions will be more pointed, and there will be more follow-ups. Now, the clip is of her answer about Israel, or at least one of her answers about the war in Israel and Gaza. And it isn't lost on me that this was the clip that CBS decided to post on the anniversary of the Hamas attack last year, which that attack and the Israeli retaliation offensive and now an invasion into Lebanon had become the foreign policy issue. And if there is one job the president has, it's foreign policy.
Does the U.S. have no sway over Prime Minister Netanyahu?
The aid that we have given Israel allowed Israel to defend itself against 200 ballistic missiles that were just meant to attack the Israelis and the people of Israel. And when we think about the threat that Hamas, Hezbollah presents, Iran, I think that it is without any question our imperative to do what we can to allow Israel to defend itself against those kinds of attacks. Now, the work that we do diplomatically with the leadership of Israel is an ongoing pursuit around making clear our principles, which include the need for humanitarian aid, the need for this war to end, the need for a deal to be done, which would release the hostages and create a ceasefire.
So there's a lot there. It's more measured and buttoned up than we've seen her be before, and certainly compared to the Call Her Daddy podcast, but it is essentially the same answer she's been giving on Israel. But I'm going to watch the interview tonight, and then I'll have a post on the Make It Make Sense Substack about it tomorrow. And because I pitched the Substack, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Please rate and review the podcast at whatever app you're listening to it on. It really helps spread the word and put it in more people's feeds. Like and subscribe on YouTube and hit the bell so you get notifications when a new episode gets posted. And then share the show on social media. It's at MIMS News Pod, MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.